Welcome back to my workshop. My name is Paul Hopewell and I show you what I've done and the way I've done it. In this video, part 10, I constructed a replacement cross slide nut, or a cross feed nut as it is called in the Southbend manual. The cross feed nut is responsible for driving the cross slide to and fro via the cross feed screw that I repaired in part 9. As you can plainly see, the cross feed nut has some play in it due to various influences, and there are still 0.03mm of play, that's about 12 thou, despite sitting on a new thread. The various influences consist of general wear and tear brought about by normal use and by abnormal operating conditions. This cross feed nut is not an original part, it's one that was made in-house some time ago. When this one was made, there were a few errors thrown in for good measure. At the time of making this nut, the centre line for the Acme feed screw thread was machined 1.5mm too high, and to compensate, a spacer 1.5mm thick was added. This spacer reduced the location spigot's length and in turn caused the feed nut to easily rock to and fro, influenced by the feed screw. This rocking motion also damaged the retaining threads in the top of the nut, thankfully not the threads on the retaining screw. Because of this rocking motion, the Acme thread diameter is worn bigger at each end of the feed nut. The only easy way I can see that this tendency to rock can be reduced is by fitting a longer feed nut. Now, if memory serves me right, when it comes to tapping an Acme thread, one should never run the tap backwards to clear the thread, and there's only so much thread a tap of this type can cut in any one go, and in this case it would be about 30mm long as far as I can remember, so about 1¼ inches. My plan at this stage was to make a long nut in two parts. The spigot position shown on the top was just to show that it exists. I had a big enough chunk of round bronze bar that had just the very nut I was looking for inside it. My job was to knock 10 bells out of it to find what I was looking for. But first I had to find the hole that contains the Acme thread. I put the bar in the other 4-jaw chuck that I had rather than my favourite drop-in one. This material was a bit off balance. Because of this I thought it best. After all, this bar is a bit hard for me to chew if it goes wrong. The hole was eventually cut to size minus 0.1mm, that's about 4 thou. Then I spent a bit of time off camera reaming it to size. This of course meant that the hole is not truly in line with the outer diameter, and this could cause a problem further down the line if I'm not careful. Anyhow, a hole is what I wanted and a hole is what I've got. The next part of my plan A was to machine the sides off in order to get this chunk of bronze to fit inside the feed screw slot. The thing is, this slot is a slot cast in iron and it's not very even along its length. So after taking my best guess, I established that I needed to take about 6mm off each side. I scribed a line across the bar end that lines up with the hole, and I lay the part on 4 parallels just so that one side of the bar protruded beyond the vise by about 15mm. I know that's not the way to use parallels, but it did the job. After removing 6mm off the first side, I turned the material over and took another 6mm off the other side. The cutter sounds a bit rough, that's because it's a roughing cutter. And although it can face cut, its primary job is to side cut. I've made this one a little bit wider than the old nut. Can't think why, I'm sure I've got a reason. There, that looks a bit more like a feed nut now, don't it? Okay, maybe a little bit more work. Like the original feed nut, my bit of bar fitted like a worm down a rabbit hole, but with a little less room than the old one. Before I dare put this nut back in the slot again, I spent a minute linishing better radiuses on the bottom corners, if you can call them that. I marked out the relief gap and plonked it back in the milling vise, and I did my damnedest to remove the excess material without running for the hills. Apart from reaming the Acme thread hole to size using an adjustable reamer, everything that's been machined so far has been with a little bit of poetic license. That is, that it's open limit. Size doesn't really matter, so long as it fits, that is. However, what I do from now on needs to work from a datum. I'll just take a short break here to tell you about my sticker wall. This is my old whiteboard that I'm going to have repositioned somewhere in my workshop where it can be seen more readily. Which brings me on to tell you that a little while ago I went to Nell's Mechanical Man Cave and met with Neil. While there, I had a tour of his workshop and saw many of his gadgets and projects. His channel is the kind of channel I like to visit because there are many fresh ideas, some that I will use in my own workshop. Just before I left, he presented me with a sticker, my first one, and until then I hadn't even considered having a sticker wall, so here you go, pal, you're the first one. Cheers. Back to the job in hand. And my now plan B. What I'm drawing here is the underside of the cross slide and the now rearranged feed nut. I'm doing this because I realise that the feed screw fits in a different way round, and this has broadened the possibilities. That's my excuse anyway, and I'm sticking to it. So what you see now is plan B, but it very quickly becomes plan C. Because after drawing this little modification, I realised that the last bit on the right of this drawing could simply be bolted straight onto the end of the spigoted section, separated by a 2 to 3 mm spacer without the fancy lips or recesses. A part of my modified plan is now going to have as much of the feed nut pressing on the underside of the cross slide to reduce the potential to rock. And when the whole nut is assembled with its spacer, the screw will be engaged in a nut that is twice as long as the original. And with a simple re-shimming, any wear can be adjusted out. Remember earlier I said that I need a datum. Well, the datum is the centre of the hole that I reamed for the Acme screw, and from that I have to find the exact distance from the underside of the cross slide to the centre of the feed screw. For this I chose to put the cross slide in place and fully engage the cross feed bush. By measuring the gap between the underside of the cross slide and the top of the cross feed bush, coupled with half the diameter of the cross feed bush, the answer becomes a simple mathematical calculation. The thing is, how am I going to get a measurement from fresh air and get it to run true to the reamed hole? Well, you've got about 5 seconds to work that out before I show you how I did it. Here's your first clue. Right, the first thing I did was measure the ground centre's diameter and halved that figure. Touch on a feeler or your preferred shim for measurement. I chose a cigarette paper at 0.025mm, that's about a thou. Subtracted the centre's radius plus 0.025mm from the 20.18mm dimension. The result is the height to raise the cutter plus another 5.5mm to clean up across the top of the spigot's face. A quick wipe of the table and a suitable mill vise was loosely slotted between the two grinding centres. To keep the material in the right orientation, I machined a suitable bar to the same size as the Acme hole and end and centred it. This bar, which was a good fit in the feed nut body by the way, is the tool that initially supports the cross feed nut in the correct orientation between the two centres. The mill vise is then clamped to it, and then in turn it is clamped to the table. That takes care of the top face. The centre of the spigot was calculated from using the old feed nut and its relationship between the end of the acme thread and the end of the feed screw slot in the main slide casting. The diameter of the spigot needs to be bigger than 3/4 of an inch, and then some, for turning to size later. The 20.18 dimension was machined to size in 2 cuts. I used slip gauges here to confirm the cutter height. Then I could finish the lead screw centred to the top mating face at the 20.18mm dimension. Now to drill and tap the oil hole and the feed nut retaining screw thread. I think you'll have noticed by now that to get one big part look like one small part, I had to put it through a bandsaw, which I did, and then I buffed it down to make it look much better. The first scribe mark is an almost carbon copy of the original nut. The longitudinal mark is obviously the centre mark, or it will be when I find it. Oh, that don't look too good. Shame about the lousy dot mark. Anyway, the whole thing sat nicely in the 4-jaw chuck. Then with a bit of aid from a dead centre I managed to cajole the nut into place, enabling me to machine the spigot to fit the recess on the underside of the cross slide. Using the same fitted dowel allowed the material to be remounted back in the same place between centres on the milling vise. This also had the added advantage of confirming that the dot mark was on centre according to the index wheel on the x-axis. I drilled the oil hole first, and in doing so I had to accept collateral damage to the fitted dowel. At least there would be no burrs in the bore. The tapping drill went down to a depth equal to 4mm off the dowel. I was going to use the mill to tap the hole here, but I chickened out at the last minute because I can't trust that the mill would wind down fast enough. There's no problem finishing by hand. Now you can see that Plan C is beginning to shine through. This is how I'm now going to put these two parts together, separated by a 3mm aluminium spacer. And all 3 parts are going to be bolted together using a couple of 3/16 Whitworth caphead screws. The spacer was first roughed out on the bandsaw, then blued and scratched to form the shape of the 2 parts of the nut. To finish this spacer I used a belt sander and plenty of cold water. All 3 parts of the nut are all bolted together with a single bolt. This was holding everything together nice and tightly, allowing me to linish everything to remove any unnecessary marks. There's a good reason for using 3/16 Whitworth screws, and that was because they were the only ones I had that had the length at around 6mm diameter. I also had to put them quite close to the sides of the nut because the threads are awfully close to the acme thread bore. After marking out the 2 fastening holes, I had to cut the top few threads off this bolt, enabling me to drill to full depth with the tapping drill. I returned to the milling machine to drill these 2 holes, and because I had to hold the part to one side of the milling vise, I placed a jack under the bottom of the workpiece to keep it in place and keep it stable. It was a long time ago, so I hope you'll forgive me if I get this bit wrong. I seem to remember that when using an acme threaded tap, one must never wind back to clear the threads because it can damage the thread. I also sort of remember that because of this there is a maximum depth and Acme thread will cut properly through a certain material. And as I understand it, for bronze the maximum depth of thread is around about 30mm deep, about 1¼ inches. Like I said, it was a long time ago and I've probably imagined the whole thing, but there we go. I threaded the spigoted part of the knot first and gave it a whiz on the new Acme threaded rod. As you can imagine, I'm very impressed with myself because it fits like a glove. At this point I fastened the two parts together using the two fixing screws, and I used the freshly cut spigoted part of the nut to act as a guide for the tap to start the Acme thread on the second part of the nut true to the first. You'll notice that I used two adjustable wrenches to work the tap through. That's because I couldn't find my large tap wrench. Now it's time for a test fit, and as you can imagine it still fits like a glove. What I do know is that the spigot fits very nicely in the cross slide and the nut hasn't any play or backlash. One other thing I know is that you'll have to wait until the next video to see it all put together. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.